Test.
Check 1 2 1 2.
Yes. Yes, 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 yes.
I'm talking first, so I think I'll take this with me and then I'll hand it to Marcelo
Yeah,
when
no,
it's.
that's all you guys
Yeah.
for your presentation, whether it's here or there, whatever. Okay, we're ready to start. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to this session and our first day of APPI conference in Fort McMurray, celebrating strength. We want to welcome you on behalf of APPI Council. My name is Bernice Gonzalez, counselor for APPI. Hello. Glad to see so many faces in this awesome panel we're going to have. Let's start a session. It's a panel on land supply and economic development. And I'm very pleased to introduce our three panelists this morning. We have with us Chris Booth, Manager of Community Development Planning for the Regional Municipality of Wood Buffalo. Chris oversees the branch's policy, permitting, subdivision, and forming, and socioeconomic functions, and has been involved in 2 studies over the last 5 years, assessing the region's commercial and industrial land supply. We have with us as well Amanda Haydes. Did I got that right? Yeah. Okay. Manager of Economic Development for the Regional Municipality of Wood Buffalo. And Amanda Haydes is an urban planning and economic development professional and has a demonstrated history of working with complex environments. She has extensive experience in business investment and attraction of initiatives, policy creation, urban planning, and design. Much of her success can be said to be attributed to her robust understanding of how to leverage private sector investment through traditional planning mechanisms. Last but not least, we have with us Marcelo Figueira, a soccer player by heart, urban planner and designer by trade. Marcelo is a passionate flaneur advocating to enable better cities, suburbs, and regions through urban design and sustainability principles, exploring urbanism through innovative lenses and ideas. He's currently on the exploration of Edmonton, as he's an urbanist and city builder committed to designing and delivering plans aiming to create complete communities with a respect for diversity in values, cultures, and distinct places. Our panel today, it's going to have a somewhat varied structure from what a regular panel you would expect. We would start with the first presentation. It's going to consist of 2 presentations. First one, we're going to have a presentation on topics related, like an overview of the topics of land supply and economic development. We would pause for a Q&A. During that time, the panelists will invite questions about what is needed to close the gap between sustainable community development planning and economic development. Then we would move into a second presentation in which the panelists will share with us some tools they've implemented in regards to fostering land supply and economic development connections. After that, we would have our final Q&A session. Well, all questions that might have come to mind to you, anything that has come up, curiosities, anything that has been stirred up by the presentations they've given us, you can present it at that time. And that would conclude our panel. And the participants will be allowed to challenge preconceived notions about community planning and what makes economic expansion happen. Please welcome Chris, Amanda, and Marcelo.
Light is green, trap is clean. Sorry, that was a Ghostbusters joke. Good morning, everyone. Thank you very much for the kind introduction, Bernice. I hope you don't mind if I stand. I know that can be kind of unusual if... Sorry, Jerry. I know it can be kind of unusual. I know we're probably going to be having a little bit of a discussion, but I do want to be able to reference the slides that I have behind me. What we were hoping to do was a little bit of an introduction for you to Fort McMurray, to the regional municipality of Wood Buffalo, and to land demand and how that is assessed. So what I'll start off with is just recapping, just very quickly, what Bernice has described for us today. So bear with me 1 minute. It always takes me a little bit of time to get used to the first controller I use. So, as you've already heard, what we're going to be learning about, just to set the stage in this presentation, is how did we get to where we are today? Fort McMurray was never quite like this, as some of us in the audience will remember. 10 years ago, the story was very different. We were in panic mode, so to speak. We were very reactive to what was happening. Fast forward 10 years, and now we're in a position where we can actually intentionally, proactively plan for growth and development. It was very difficult to do that before. We're going to open it up at that point for a little bit of discussion. If some of you have questions about that 10-year period, which Amanda and I went through, if you have questions about that, let's talk about it during that time when it's fresh. After that, we'll jump into a tool that we used, two tools that we used to proactively and intentionally plan for the future. And Marcelo will bring us through that because at that time, Silas, their firm, which is now rolled into AE, at that time we contracted them to do these studies for us. So I can think of no one better than to bring you through it. So what I'll do now is bring you a little bit into this story of the boomtown. And Amanda has been here just a little bit longer than I have, so I think what I'll do is I'll turn it over to Amanda to provide you with that context.
Sure, thank you, Chris. As Chris mentioned, we when we were talking about how we were going to approach this panel today, we really do want to have more of a conversation. So if there's any questions, please feel free to interrupt us as we're going along, or if we're missing anything, please, by all means, we're open to that. As Chris had suggested, I came here in 2007 from Toronto, and when I came, I went to Ryerson School of Urban and Regional Planning. And I remember being approached by someone who worked in the planning department for Wood Buffalo, and I was like, where's this place, Wood Buffalo? And they're like, oh, it's Fort McMurray. And I'm like, where's Fort McMurray? Like, I had no idea about what was going on in this region. So as you can see by the map that's here on the screen, it's kind of, the colors are a bit off, but we are northern Alberta, as you know, you're here today. But the interesting thing about this region is we are embedded in the largest oil sands deposit in the world, the third largest oil reserve in the world, and we are tucked away at the northern part of Canada. We've got 9 rural communities that surround our city of Fort McMurray, so that in and of itself creates a lot of challenges for our region because we're so big. We're 66,000 kilometers. We're the size of Nova Scotia and PEI combined. So just the scale of our geography alone presents a lot of challenges that we have to deal with as planners. If you go forward to the next slide here, this sort of puts into perspective the type of deposit that our region is located in, the Athabasca oil sands. And I mentioned it's the third largest oil reserve in the world. So obviously that's our biggest industry, and with that has brought so many challenges and opportunities for our region. If you fast, yeah. So this slide here, what it shows a few things. You look at 2010 being on the left and the projection to 2035, and we have, this chart basically puts into perspective the barrels of oil that are being taken out every day. And despite the economic slowdown, many people think that oil production has actually slowed down in our region. It hasn't. It's increased. It increases year over year over year, despite the price of oil being lower. And as you can see for the forecast, it's also projected to grow as well. And these are things that we are always very cognizant of. Traditionally, our population has coincide with the oil production in our region. With the advancement of technologies, however, that's starting to change a little bit. But these are all the little pieces and elements that we need to consider as planners. This chart here puts into perspective our population. So you look at the year 2000 and you fast forward to 2015, and you could see that there was, significant growth in our region. And those are the very elements that we had to contend with on a daily basis. The area that we are in right now, being 2019, things have slowed down quite a bit in our region. There are different types of challenges and different components that we have to deal with today, and we'll get into much more of that detail later on in the presentation. But it's interesting because between the year 2000 and 2018, there is a story there. There's so many different elements as to what was going on from that period, and that's what we want to bring you through today. So I'm going to pass the microphone over. You can start going through those pieces.
Thank you very much, Amanda. So what I'm going to put on the screen for you is a little bit of a summary of our past reality. This is what we were going through for a while 10 years ago. This was a period where we had a very strong economy. There was robust business interest, as Amanda can testify to, and there were some of the highest incomes in Alberta. That high population growth, however, created some challenges for us, not the least of which was a lack of infrastructure. It was very hard to keep pace with what was happening. There were years in which we were literally processing thousands of development permits a year. There was low land supply because we were going and building so quickly. We were chewing through that land faster than the province could bring it online. And that's a very unique challenge that I think the RMWB has, and I'm not sure whether other people in the room have also faced that challenge, where all the land that surrounds Fort McMurray is Crown land. So at the time, we had absolutely no control or jurisdiction over it. So we were at the mercy of the province to be able to release that land for new development. So of course that caused housing prices to skyrocket because we couldn't quite keep up. Another one of the challenges that we ran into was, of course, low vacancy rates and expensive labor, because it was a very popular place to be. Companies were competing for talent, so the wages were increasing, which made it challenging for some businesses to also locate here because they had to compete with those very high salaries. And finally, high construction costs. There was, I remember coming here, managers would tell me that there's this Fort McMurray factor. The cost of construction elsewhere was very different from what it was here. And over the last 10 years, I've started to really appreciate why that was. So this was the past, and what I'll do is I'll invite, if there's anything I've missed here that Amanda would like to add to this, I'll ask her to do so.
Just to kind of go to that slide, Chris, that you were speaking to as well. And Chris went through a lot of these pieces, but the interesting thing, so I started off in urban planning at the planning department, and I sort of slowly went over to economic development. And the interesting thing that most people, I guess, we didn't even really think about it. We didn't have to try to attract businesses to Fort McMurray. They were knocking on our doors, trying to get in, and we actually had the opposite problem where there were so many people and so many companies that were popping up here in this region that their business acumen wasn't very strong, and so we were filling gaps with new businesses, unexperienced businesses. We had, our real estate was just so high. At one point, we had rates that were comparable to Young and Bloor. So we were dealing with vacancies that were pretty much near 0%, and we were also dealing with rates that were $80 a square foot for commercial and retail property and industrial property in Fort McMurray. And at Young and Bloor, that's what that rate was going at. We'll talk about where our reality is today, but combine that with the fact that we had almost a 0% vacancy rate for residential homes, so we didn't have many people who were in the service industry that could afford to live in Fort McMurray, which then drove up the price of our hourly wage, and it impacted small businesses, large businesses. We were literally in a state of panic. Essentially, that's what it was. You look at new development that was occurring in our region. Timberlea, if some of you are familiar with it, when it was first built out, it was primarily all residential. There was no real commercial or retail that could service that population, because at that point in time, we literally had nowhere to put people. We didn't have homes, we didn't have beds, and we were just trying to get houses on the market as fast as possible. If we can just go back to that slide to make sure that I'm not missing anything here. The other piece of it was the lack of infrastructure. So while we were trying to build out a city, we actually didn't have the underground services or water, sewer, utilities. We didn't have the infrastructure in place that could just accommodate all these new people either. And then combine that with the fact that a lot of people were renting out their basin apartments. There was a term that used to be called hotbedding. So shift workers would literally have one bedroom in Fort McMurray, sleep in it for, say, 8 hours, go to work, then another shift who was on a different schedule would come in, go into that same bedroom, sleep in the bed, and there was always someone in the house, in that room. And that was just the reality that we were dealing with. When the economy started to slow down, our region started to take a look at, okay, how do we start thinking about our approach to accommodating this population? We know that oil isn't going anywhere anytime soon. We know that we are going to grow at some level, and that's what the next slide here really talks about is, what did we do? What did we do to prepare the region for where it is today? We still have a ton of challenges, but this kind of paints a bit of a picture as to the pieces that our planning group was working on, engineering, private sector, oil industry. So the first thing that the region started to really take consideration is our infrastructure. And most of you are probably familiar with Highway 63 and the fatalities that have happened on that corridor. And aside from that, there's also there's a lot of toxic and dangerous goods that are being brought to and from all along that Highway 63. So all of the toxic material that goes going up to the oil sands follows through on Highway 63. And that's also played a huge part into our infrastructure planning and how do we think about the safety of residents while still maintaining our main industry, which is oil. We've managed to oversize all of our utilities, water, sewage. So we're right now at a place where all of our infrastructure in the city can actually accommodate twice our population. So we're able to double our population and not have to worry about the infrastructure per se. Available land, we worked very closely with the provincial government, and we were able to get land releases and put supply onto the market. And it's been interesting because, let's say 8 years ago, there was barely any land. The cost was astronomical. Now we have tons of land in our market, but people outside of Fort McMurray, investors, they don't know. They think that we're stuck in the same time period we were 10 years ago. And the availability of land, in one sense, it has definitely opened up opportunities for businesses. But in another sense, it's actually capped them. And it's an interesting dynamic because if you look at, if you have a chance to go into our Timberlea area, there's a whole new commercial development there that is actually charging $80 a square foot. It's, again, the highest in Canada for that type of retail. It's a movie theater, a bar, there's a yoga studio, like typical neighborhood retail stuff. You tell any investor that, and they don't even want to look at Fort McMurray because that's a scary number. But then you look at the downtown. So we've just put all this new commercial and development up in the Timberlea area. What has that done to the downtown? It's totally drove down the price of rent in the downtown. So now in the downtown, you can probably get something for around $30 to $40 a square foot. So it's interesting because we're putting a new class of real estate onto the market, which is now emptied some of the stuff in our downtown, making it an opportunity for some smaller businesses to get into. However, now we have other challenges. We're not in an environment right now where people are knocking down our doors to try to get into Fort McMurray. So now we actually have to work to try to fill these spaces in the downtown, whereas before, any space in Fort McMurray was just taken up almost instantly. I'll pass it over to you so you can keep going through some elements.
Thank you, Amanda. Before I speak, I want to ask a question. How many people came through our airport, either this morning or last night? Awesome. Thank you. That airport was constructed for millions of passengers because at the time that it was built, the old airport was overflowing. Has anyone been through our old airport? It was tough, wasn't it? Very hard to get a seat anywhere. You're shoulder to shoulder, literally standing shoulder to shoulder with people in the waiting area. Now we have this brand new infrastructure that's been provided for us, and it really tells this paints a picture of how we were trying to prepare for growth, how we were trying to prepare for lots of people. The new and expanded medical facilities is something else I want to point out because there's a lot of people who are very proud of that as well. We've finally been able to provide some aging-in-place facilities for some of our local senior residents. For a very long time, there was only a couple of very small facilities for them, and some of them weren't even providing the services that they needed. A lot of people were occupying the 5th floor of our hospital. It's not a very nice way to spend your life, sitting on the 5th floor of a hospital. So now we have this dedicated aging-in-place facility that's being constructed in the corner of Hospital Street and Franklin Avenue. The hospital actually now is a heliport, because for the longest time, if anyone ran into trouble on site, got injured, they'd be medevaced, but they would have to be medevaced to the airport and then driven down to the hospital. Could you imagine what that would be like if you had lost a limb, your life was in danger, and you had to take that 15-minute, or maybe 10 if it's going fast. But those minutes count. Now finally they have a helipad at the hospital. So that sort of paints this picture of how we've been trying to prepare ourselves. And the last thing I want to mention here is that Silas, you see these abbreviations we put up here, Silas and the retail market analysis is what I'm suggesting is RMA, the retail market analysis. And Silas stands for the Commercial and Industrial Land Use Study. These, along with the Conference Board of Canada report, were produced a couple of years ago to highlight for us what our needs were, where the economy was going in the future, what we needed to prepare for, how much land we actually needed. Those were questions we needed to answer to be able to plan better for the future. So that is where I want to jump into where we are today. Where do we now sit? Where have we had successes? First and foremost, we're in a situation now where we've done all that we needed to do. We've set this fantastic stage for development, but it's not coming as fast as it used to. So that's a challenge. That's sort of adversity. You know, this panel is talking about planning through times of economic adversity. Well, that's what we're going through right now, is how do we now fight to attract those very limited number of retailers? And I know many other communities in the province are also going through the same thing. So for a long time, I'm not sure if this is true, but was Fort McMurray viewed as a very different microcosm from other places in Alberta? And I think it might have been. But now, I'd suggest that we've normalized. We're now going through exactly the same stuff that other communities are going through. The economy is slower. We're now only dealing with a couple of larger developments a year. That's a fairly normal rate of growth for a lot of communities. We also have issues with uncertainty on the pipeline front. And that's because our economy, as Amanda has pointed out, is so closely intertwined with the oil industry that any bottlenecks that are occurring are impacting our ability to grow and hiring in the oil sands. So now that we have this high land supply, it's had this chain reaction, and now we have lower land prices. We have much higher vacancies. So it's very easy to find places now to live. It's more affordable. We're the second most affordable community in Canada to live in. That's amazing. That's a huge story for this region, which is why the external negative perception of the region is a challenge for us, because it's been viewed in a certain way for so long, and we're trying to combat those messages. And it's groups like the newly formed Wood Buffalo Economic Development Corporation that are trying to change those brands, and they've successfully started to do so. And Amanda can talk about this later during the panel. But there are these things that we've done very successfully. So the question I want to put out to the floor right now, and you can either choose to answer this now, can choose to answer this later during the panel Q&A. But this is what I want to pose to the floor. As professional planners, how do we challenge preconceived notions about community planning to encourage development and growth in this environment? I don't want to put you on the hot seat yet, but that's the question I'm going to throw out, because that's really the function of this panel. So every day I can speak from my own experience, I know Amanda can speak from hers, and I'm sure many of you can speak to yours. But every day you have businesses who are interested in coming here, and usually they ask, what are you willing to do for us? What are you going to do for us? How are you going to make things easier for us to locate here? That's challenging a preconceived notion. Because for a very long time, we've been able to say, well, you got to get in line. We can afford to really toe the line on everything. But can we do that anymore? Can we toe the line on all of our regulations and all of our rules?
I can, well, if you don't mind, I can kind of describe some of the elements that the municipality was involved with for the creation of the Wood Buffalo Economic Development Corporation. So when we started off the presentation and we're talking about a time where it was the boom town and things were in a panic, our economic development team, they were mostly relationship-based and networking on the behalf of the municipality at local events and such. As the economy started to shift and there became a need to actually try to get businesses into Fort McMurray and Wood Buffalo, we had many conversations around what is that role, what role does the municipality play in this? And as we started to try to make steps in bringing in businesses into Fort McMurray, we were learning that we were getting put up against decisions that council were making, or the time lag, and if you wanted to get land on the market, having to go through all these processes in and above the actual system of trying to attract investors and business into Fort McMurray. It became a very difficult challenge for us, and it was almost like we were not achieving what we set out to achieve. So the conversation started happening a couple of years ago around how does an economic development corporation function and how could we introduce something like this into our region. The decision was made to create an entire separate entity whose sole purpose is to attract investment and business into the region. When you layer on top of that the complexities of us being in a region where we have a lot of First Nation and a lot of Métis settlements, there's so many opportunities in our region, and it's happening daily. There are a lot of businesses who are First Nation owned, who are actively involved in providing for the oil sands. They're in the chain supply. But how do we grow that and open that opportunity up and really tell Canada about what's happening here in our region? And that's become another part of the element of Wood Buffalo Economic Development Corporation is kind of taking that opportunity that we have here right now and growing it. The other elements of the Economic Development Corporation is the branding. So outside of Fort McMurray, our region does not have a good image. We've been attending the International Conference of Shopping Centers the last year, and you take one walk around that room and talk to people about Alberta, they don't even want to talk to you. If you talk to them about Fort McMurray, they really don't want to talk to you. And it was eye-opening to me because in all these years, it was always people trying to come into Fort McMurray, like we were the show, and now it's like total opposite. It's flipped on its, totally flipped around. And it's interesting because now we have to think about how do we get businesses here and how do we shift the perception. So the things that have changed, and Chris, we kind of touched on all this, but we have a labor supply. When I first came here, the unemployment rate was less than 2%. People were literally hiring people who were alive, basically. Like if you were alive, you got a job. And it was the truth. Like even when I was in the planning department, I remember getting promoted to planner 2, and I didn't even feel like a sense of like accomplishment because I was like I managed to like keep a heartbeat in 2 years because it was that crazy here. Like that was the reality in Fort McMurray. Well, now we have an unemployment rate. It's 8.5%. So we actually have an available labor pool, but businesses and companies outside of Fort McMurray, they don't realize that. And they still think, oh, I can't get labor. I'm not going to look there. I can do my same model in another area, Red Deer, Grand Prairie, wherever. Like they're still going to return on their investment. They also have no real understanding of our infrastructure. And what we actually have here is capacity. Our downtown is another example. We're starting to look at initiatives for development. Right now, we do have no off-site levies in the downtown. Like, these are really big things, but in the big world of investment and development, these things aren't being communicated, and a large part of the Economic Development Corporation is to take on that role. Again, Fort McMurray never had to even advertise outside of Fort McMurray. We didn't have to do anything. Like, people just basically came here, but now we have to really get out there and have those conversations. You look at the cost of housing, and we touched on this earlier, but it's so key. We now are in a market where people can afford to purchase a house, which means we can afford to have service industry. When I first came to Fort McMurray, I believe it was Tim Hortons closed at like 6:30 or 7 o'clock p.m. And I'm like, where am I? Like, this doesn't happen in other communities. You would see signs outside a superstore hiring $30 an hour, and it was just, that was the reality. Whereas now it's, like Chris had said, we have normalized, and I would argue that we are very similar to most Albertan communities right now, and we have very similar challenges, whereas in the past we had opposite challenges. With the Economic Development Corporation, it's given a chance for I guess, time and resources to be solely focused on bringing investment and opportunity and growing local businesses in town. As a planner, I do find it challenging with the workload that everybody has to take that step back and really strategically think about, hey, what sectors are we insufficient on? Where do we need to start amping up our attraction? Is the development permitting process working? Is our system, like as a planning department, or how we function with engineering? All these big questions, people typically don't have time to spend the energy to try to fix, in a sense. Having a group like the Economic Development Corporation, what I've learned, while their feet are still wet and they're not fully established yet, they have done a great job in having those conversations and at least trying to put Fort McMurray out there on the map, and I think it's been a really good tool for our region, alongside of what we were working on in terms of our commercial industrial land use study, our retail market analysis, and Marcelo will talk about it in more detail, but there's a lot of pieces now as an entire province where we're not as busy as we were before, so now we do have a little bit of breathing room and some time to reflect and really adjust and think about how do we approach the next wave of growth, because more than likely it's going to happen. We should be using this time now to be thinking about that and get ourselves ready, get ourselves development ready. Even if we don't have developers knocking down on our door, when a developer comes here, are we ready to process their permits, show them where the land opportunities are? We have to have all those ducks in a row, and that's really what we've been trying to do as a region. But again, like there is always challenges that we're up against, and it'll be an interesting conversation to have with you guys around even your communities. What have you been doing? Have you been looking at things differently? Have you totally stopped doing certain components of your operations that you used to do faithfully? I think there have been a lot of adjustments in the economy, and I'm sure it's has reflected into our departments, especially as a profession as planners.
Thank you, Amanda. At this point, I think it would be very wise to turn it over to Marcelo. And before I do that, there is this one slide which we have up here that provides some answers for consideration to the question that I posed a few moments ago. These are not by any means all the possible answers. These are just some of the ones that we had thought of. So if we want to plan during times of economic diversity, do we in fact plan based on the reality instead of just our principles? So I know we all went through school, I certainly did, where we learned what is good planning, what must we always ask for. Does that change based on the reality that you're in? Do we have to collaborate a little bit more with the development industry? And I know Marcelo has a thought on this. Are there opportunities for us to speak more with them about what they need? Is there more negotiation that has to take place, more recognition of the challenges that they're going through? And as Amanda alluded to, are there efficiencies that we can find in our process to make things easier for that development to occur? So at this point, I would like to turn it over to Marcelo, and I'm going to allow you guys to give the muscles in your neck a break and look at the other direction for a change.
Good morning, everyone. Thank you for, first of all, attending our session on a beautiful Sunday afternoon, morning, and actually some other exciting section going concurrently with ours. So it's very exciting to be here today. First of all, I'd like to give a little bit of an overview about this tool, and with a disclaimer that this is not the only tool that we can have. If we have time, we can actually talk about some other tools that I use. But the Silas it looks at industrial office space, service commercial, hotel. The retail market analysis is focused more on the existing state of retail, what is the unmet demand, and what are the methodologies to attract new retailers. So they're kind of a complementary. So when we start this project, we knew that on the planning side, it would be easy for us to quantify the supply and look at the regulatory framework like the ASPs, the MDP, and the zoning regulations to actually provide that supply. On the demand side is really a challenge, and is a challenge for most municipalities and for planners. So we partnered with Colliers International. So they look at the demand and they look at the gap analysis. So why, in other words, why those businesses are not coming here. So there was kind of those two sides of the pieces. So I think we want to go a little bit more about how the reports were built, and then I'll ship over about the findings. The methodology is really complex on both sides, especially on the demand side. So if we have time, I can explain a little bit more during the Q&A. So like a big overview, what we did is we look at the total inventory of land, what were the under construction projects, what were the proposed projects, annual absorber rates, vacancy rates. Oh, thank you. Leasing rates. We reviewed the market, like what are the strengths and weaknesses of the economic sectors in the markets as it was in 2017. And then we went outside the scope of just looking at for McMurray, and we went to talk to brokers, we went to talk to investors. We actually went to Ontario to talk a lot of investments in Hiltis and in BC, and try to understand what were the future development profile, like what is kind of a type of developments that they need, so we can adjust this on the supply side and make that surplus to go away. Honestly, when we started, we knew that there was a lot of supply, or surplus on the supply side. We were not expecting that much surplus as I'm going to go to the findings in the next slide. So the focus on both reports was to understand shuffle-ready lands. So shuffle-ready for the purpose of this study was what lands were zoned, subdivided, and ready for developers to actually get into the ground in 6 months. So everything, like you have on the planning side, you have done all the planning work. On the engineering side, infrastructure was there, and they could get in 6 months if they want to. So the first thing that we found was in terms of hotel development, and there was a lot of hotels built in the past, like in the booming time that Chris and Amanda talked about. At that time, 2017, there's not much demand for a hotel. 1 hectare size would pretty much fulfill all the new demand for hotel. The other thing that we found was, in terms of office space, I wouldn't say that was overbuilt, but there was an expectation that a lot of firms would move their offices or headquarters to Fort McMurray. So there was a surplus of 21% of vacancy at that time. Industry standards for vacancy is pretty much about 10% only. So you have to kind of fill in that space before you even think about building more office space. The other thing that we found was in terms of, I just want to go back to that slide. For the especially the hotel, the standards for hotel is if you have 70 to 75% of occupancy, you're good to go. Fort Mac was at 54% of vacancy, so it is a little bit of a gap to fill in as well. So we didn't need any more hotel space. In terms of retail, so that's where the complexity of the methodology comes in with the Colliers side. So they look at the new population projections. So the population projections wasn't done by our team, was the RSCENT advisory group that did the population projections. It was a kind of a reduction from the previous years. Peak populations would be about 85,000 people. So they look at the population, actual population, look into the market capture, what was the disposable income of that population, and then they come up with what kind of a square footage would be needed for retail. So that square footage of retail, we can transform in land supply on the planning side. So the findings were that out of 125 hectares that were in surplus, we only need 16 hectares of land. So that's kind of show the pictures how much land was over. And you take a lot of years to kind of fulfill that demand, and that's where on the side of the Economic Development Corporation, they work into getting to make sure that the investments see that opportunity and come to IMWB. Just one side note here, when we talk about market capture, it's about the trade area. So we look at 3 trade areas, the primary, secondary, and tertiary trade areas, and then you can see what is the demand in that area can be attended in the local Fort McMurray area. So again, in terms of vacancy, you see 5.1% of the retail was vacant in different regions on average. So Fort McMurray North, a little bit lower, 1.2%. A lot of vacancies on the south side, and the lower town side, the core, 6.3%. The industry standard for what we call a healthy market would be between 6% and 10%. So 5.1% is not quite a healthy market for that type of vacancy rate. So again, adding retail space reduces spending outflow. So this slide is showing how much outflow of spending retail goes out of Fort McMurray every year. So that means $425 million that could be spent in IMWB are shift to other growth centers like Edmonton or Calgary or BC and Ontario. So that's a huge thing. That it is we look at this as an opportunity. So if you can build more retail space to fulfill that gap, that money would stay here. And that's kind of where the two pieces come together. So the previous economic context was kind of trying to catch up to the demand. Now that we have a lot of surplus, we can use that to kind of fulfill and make more investment staying for McMurray and IMWB. So just flip over to Chris.
Thank you, Marcelo. So that last slide that we saw there, that $435 million number, I think it's important to let that sink in, because what that tells me is if we have this much money that's flowing out that people are not spending here, every time that we make it harder for a developer to operate in the RMWB means that that's more lost opportunity. We're essentially not plugging the holes. It's like the boat is taking on water and we're just shooting more holes into the hull. So that's where I'm sort of coming from when I ask this question about how do we plan during a time of economic diversity. So at this point, I would very much like to begin a broader conversation with us. Invite your questions, your comments about how we can do this as planners.
Well, good morning. My name's Nancy Hackett. I'm here from the city of Red Deer, so thank you for welcoming Alberta to Fort McMurray. I guess it's a question around the retail projections, and I don't really do any professional work in this area, but the trends are people are shopping online. In the future, people will not physically go to the store to buy their things. They will have it delivered. So when you see stores like Payless Shoes, gone, H&M, gone, other retailers who were massive retailers and had locations throughout the US and Canada close because they can't compete with Amazon or online orders. I guess how did that factor into this? I think every community is going to face that $400 million out of their community unless you have the Amazon Center. So that would be my question of how did that factor in?
First, thank you for the question. E-commerce, it is a trend. We acknowledge that, but it doesn't come like what. It's not because you buying on the internet that you don't need the space anymore. It just shifts to a different kind of space. So distribution centers is one of the things that is happening. You need huge space, warehouse space, for actually to storage things that are bought online. So that's one of the things. I think I'm on the actually in Fort McMurray, there's a different thing going on, more in the truck and distribution.
So in terms of that whole concept, yes, there definitely is a huge shift to the online shopping. However, there is a human element to shopping, which is still very real. And if you look across a lot of the developments, newer developments in North America, when you look at retail, it's taking a shift from raw shopping experience to actually entertainment experience. So a lot of the new type of shopping centers are primarily looking at how do you weave entertainment into a shopping area, and that's how you differentiate between online and physical in person. There's also a really interesting shift happening right now with research around okay, here's the example. So it's a study it's actually been a year and a half now into the making. It's headed up by Best Buy. What they did was they looked at two communities that had the similar population, similar dynamics, similar catchment areas, and they had one community where they did not place a store in the community. They took the other community and they built a smaller scale Best Buy. They started to look at the trends in shopping of the residents in those cities, and they noticed that astronomically the sales online for the city that had a Best Buy store were higher than the city that did not have a Best Buy. And what they're starting to see a relationship with is people, while stores are suffering in terms of their sales, shoppers who are going into the stores are using those stores as more of like a shopping center or a catalog, and they're looking at what they want to buy, they're contemplating it, they're doing their online research, and they may make the decision to purchase the product a week later, 2 weeks later, but they're purchasing the product. And so Best Buy is starting to look at how do they scale their stores now? Like maybe they're going to start doing smaller catalog type stores where they have their products there, people can go in, touch them and feel them. They know that the store is not going to turn over a large sales volume, but that presence of the store will actually impact the online shopping. And it's something that we need to consider too as planners, is maybe the scale of shopping. Maybe the 20,000, 40,000 square foot shops, they're not over with, but maybe that whole dynamic is starting to shift. And then you combine that with the entertainment and the experience shopping.
Hi, Kim from Clearwater County. I just wanted to make a small comment about that too. I think with online shopping, I live in Rocky. We don't have a lot of big stores, so I do a lot of online shopping. But I think it's helpful if you have a place that does have a store. Sometimes even when you're online, they're like, hey, is this available in store? Or you can pick it up at your store. So that immediate satisfaction thing that people are looking for, if it's immediately available, you don't have to wait 2-3 days, a week to get something. You can get it right away. So I think that helps with the online too. They're like, hey, you can find this right now if you want, and you save shipping or time. So that's a component of the online thing to draw people to the stores if it's locally available as well. So that's just kind of a point there.
And if you pick it up in a store, then it doesn't get stolen off of your front step. Yes.
Hi, I'm Ann from City of Edmonton. My question is about the study, and one of the things that's really interesting and unique about Fort McMurray is that you do have that legacy of what you were 10 years ago. And so when you think about a traditional land use study, how you would account for that retail vacancy and where people are spending your money and the leakage, I think is slightly different because you have that relic that at the time was really necessary of having the camps, which led to the fly-in, fly-out community members. And I think I'm really interested in how did you account for in your modeling the losses that were occurring because of people not actually being in the community to spend the money. So they're here for 3 weeks and then they go home and spend their paycheck in Kelowna or wherever they were, Edmonton. Thank you for your business. We appreciate it. And how did that impact the model and also the planning for infrastructure? Because you now have people that are also using your infrastructure, which you have to build, but you don't get the money necessarily for it in the same way. So I'm just interested because that's something that's very, I think, unique to you guys that most communities won't have to deal with.
Yeah, one of the key pieces of the puzzle was really the new population projections, because they also account for a new profile, right? So we do account, actually Colliers has a dedicated model for retail and industrial demand, and we have to change that model to accommodate a different population that we're not living in work camps anymore, we're not just living here anymore. It was based on population that were fixing for McMurray. That fly in, fly out in the booming times was really important, but in the new context was really minimal kind of influence in the purchase power for the new demand.
Was there planning to try and find a way to bring some of that into the community so that they could contribute? This is a pretty big area.
It's a very good question. And that particular conundrum, if I can just paraphrase, your question is, with the camps existing, with the thousands and thousands and thousands of beds that we do have out there in the hinterland, how do we bring them in? Can we bring them in? How do we get that purchasing power into the community? Is a very good question, and that's something that our local council is struggling with as we speak. There have been conversations around moratoriums on new camps. There have been conversations around how can we better regulate those camps such that it is, for lack of a better word, just a little bit harder to be able to justify having one. Because you're quite right, you know, with the community the way it is and our population being more stable now, there is a need to be able to try to attract people into the community, and the camps are seen as a source for that, is the short answer.
You started to talk about working with First Nations and Métis on some of the economic development. Can you share, I guess just elaborate on that, you know, like what kind of model or what kind of strategies are you guys implementing? Because it's just funny because I just happened to meet a lady yesterday, the Northeastern Aboriginal Association, I think, and we talked about economic development, right, and job procurement, and how their association is working with Aboriginal people, and acumen, business acumen, and just trying to create some partnerships. So I just wondered if you can share some more, maybe like a specific example.
So in our region, oil industry gives preference to Aboriginal-owned businesses. And that's a really good thing for our region because we have a lot of successful First Nation-owned businesses that are in our region. So when you look at the supply chain for oil sands, there is a high percentage of that supplied by First Nation-owned companies. That number, though, is still lower than what they want it to be. And there's a lot of concentration and a lot of energy being put towards building up these businesses, but also partnering them with other businesses from outside of Fort McMurray, for example, to open up opportunity. So the interesting thing is in Fort McMurray, there's been a lot of advancements in technology and a lot of advancements around Indigenous businesses that we don't really brag about. We just kind of do our business as we do it. And now that the times have slowed down a bit, the conversation around what we're doing in Fort McMurray right now and the caliber that these First Nation companies are at is very high. And it's actually a model that Wood Buffalo and the Economic Development Corporation is starting to look at and to say, hey, like we have something here, and this is actually something that we can go outside of Canada and throughout Canada with to use as an example of how you create a system where that could work in. There's a term that it's kind of derogatory, but it's a real term that you hear often is rent-a-feather, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, where you've got companies who are literally just trying to come into the region, partner with Aboriginal-owned companies just to get the jobs. And we've had that problem in the past, and Leanne, the lady from NABA that you spoke of, there's a lot of I should say, rigor that's being put in place right now. They've hired a lawyer out of the States to even look at how are these businesses structured? Are they actually, in fact, 51% or more First Nation? Or are they a facade? And just on paper, they're Aboriginally owned. And it's really been a huge undertaking for our region, and it's put a lot of pride into the real ownership of these businesses, which is First Nation. So you can't be a NABA member here unless you prove that you are actually 51% at least controlled by a First Nation or Aboriginal ownership. And it's been really cool to see that whole progression take place, and we're like right in the thick of it right now. But there's definitely so many opportunities, and we even look at not just how the opportunities are how those opportunities look like in the region today. We're looking at bringing in one example. It's a kind of a basic example. It's around a cleaning company. This cleaning company is now having conversations around cleaning like toxic waste and like bringing it into much of a bigger realm. This cleaning company is from Edmonton. We've partnered them with a First Nation business here in Fort McMurray. That company now, that large company, is in Fort McMurray, and they're starting to build a new business partnership here in our region. The next step then is to say, okay, well, where there's other natural resources, can we take this model, this business, can that business start exporting their services and start looking at how do we expand outside of our region? Because the whole conversation around diversity and how do we diversify our economy, at the end of the day, whichever way you slice it, we're oil town, but that's what we are. But can we not be so dependent on what's happening here in our town and have our businesses offering services, products outside of the region, so at least if there is a slowdown here, that can kind of keep the people in our town going for a little bit longer than normal.
So I've watched the planning and growth and challenges in Fort McMurray for a long time with a lot of interest because it's such an intriguing municipality and Wood Buffalo as a whole, but Fort McMurray, the community, it's very different from anywhere else in that it's so tied to one industry, and the booms and busts of sort of population and economy are really challenging. And I sometimes wonder if the standard municipal tools and processes that we have for other municipalities like Edmonton or Calgary or smaller towns throughout Alberta really work here effectively, or if you wish in some ways, if I were a camp manager, I would have, maybe 10,000 units, and I would contract out Tim Hortons to come in and put in a business and all of those types of things. And then when oil prices drop, I just shut things down and end those contracts. You have that autonomy and authority to do those things. But because you're tied into, the MGA, just like other communities, and you see these radical changes. So I guess my question is, do you think that sort of the standard approach that we have in municipalities elsewhere in Alberta, works really well in Fort McMurray, or should there be a different model because of the unique economic circumstances where you see radical growth and then degrowth, and that could keep happening for a long time?
Thank you. That's a question that I have to think about. There's been a lot of talk over the last 10 years that I've been here about a Fort McMurray approach, a made in Fort McMurray approach. It's something that happens often with council as well. They'll say, will that work here? Will that standard approach really work? And sometimes the answer is yes. I think the MGA is written in such a way that it provides a great deal of wiggle room in some respects. Particularly as far as statutory plans are concerned, especially. There's a lot that you can do in there. So we've made liberal use of that flexibility in some cases in writing plans that encompass many, many different topics outside of what's just in the MGA. On a regulatory side, I think that it has been working. And where we're now starting to see the challenge is where the regulation is just too much. It's just a burden for some developers, and I don't think that's a challenge that's unique to Fort McMurray. So what I'd suggest is that the tools afforded to us, the standard processes, they work. It's just how does each municipality find a way to either go. Basically just find a balance. Do you go too far? Do you make it very liberal? So I think we can, and we have, sort of cooked up a recipe that works for us. And right now we have a land use bylaw that's under development right now. We're rewriting it. And we're taking a look at those approaches, and we're talking to community members and developers and saying, what works for you? What has not worked for you in the bylaw for all these years? So I'm very confident that the rules and standard processes can continue to work.
Bob, interesting because at the same time that we were doing this project with IMWB, we were also working for the County of Grand Prairie and for the City of Camrose with similar problems. But in Grand Prairie, it's more about gas, right? It's not oil. And there is a kind of a clear picture between a lot of commercial retail goes into the city and industrial goes into the county. So the county was looking at a strategy for 50 years down the road. They want to know what kind of jobs are going to be around in 50 years. So that's kind of a impossible question to answer almost, right? So we took a different turn into land and demand from the perspective that what the communities would look like in 50 years or in 30 years per se, and what kind of a workforce would be there, and what were the needs for the workforce. So because most of the findings from that study were like, you don't need a lot of land in the future for the type of industry that are going to be around. So you need to actually retain people in the community that buy into a lifestyle, buy into the community values and social profile, so to speak. Right? In Camrose, we're working to their downtown plan, and I don't know if you've been to Camrose, but Highway 13 across the city east-west. There's a very established highway commercial there, and they have a really, really nice main street in downtown. So what would you do to bring economic development to the city, but at the same time minimize or avoid competition between the highway commercial corridor and the downtown? So different tools for different problems around the same issue, and different strategies. And that's why we kind of start saying that Silas and retail is not, they're not only the only tools available, there's other things that we can do.
Stephen Rates with the City of Beaumont. Thank you so much for the great discussion so far. I'm hoping we can kind of loop back to a little tidbit that was shared earlier on about the trend we're seeing with retail kind of operations now, sort of focusing more on entertainment. And I'm hoping that we can have some commentary about how we as planners can best facilitate or create those experiences. In some ways, retail development might take less regulation or less involvement from the municipality because it just gets built. But from your perspectives, how can we as planners best assist with developing that cohesive entertainment experience within retail areas? Is it just streetscaping, or is it brokering relationships with developers to build that out and create an experience for residents and for visitors? Just interested in hearing more about that.
I know Amanda probably has an answer to that or a comment on that, so I'll turn it over to her shortly. But I'll start off with, from my own experience, what I've seen happening in those situations where you get those blended uses. What I've noticed planners doing more and more is, as you said, developing a relationship with that developer, getting into a bit more of a negotiation about how can we make all these uses coexist. In Fort McMurray, sometimes our sites are very small. And we run into a challenge about trying to mix these all together. Sometimes the parking requirements are very high, for example. So one area that we've had to negotiate a lot with on is shared parking, or about how you recognize that some uses have peak day times where they're very busy, they have a lot of cars coming, but then things like the theater or restaurants might be more of an afternoon thing. So from a planning perspective, I think we've identified that those are areas where we can allow the two to coexist from a planning perspective, and understanding how we can apply the regulations in such a way that we can still enable the activity to happen, but recognizing there's perhaps off-peak and peak hours that we can take into consideration.
Yeah, and one of the things that we are also found in the retail analysis, that there's still that niche for the brick and mortar. Like, that's not going to go away. There are people that go for online shopping for the price, lowest price, or for the big chain brands, right? But there's room for accommodating both. In between, I think it's what Amanda is talking about, is the entertainment experience. So people that they do more than just going for shopping. Like, they want to, through that purchase, experience something else. So that's the environment, that's the urban design, your streetscape, and so on and so forth. So we found those niches, and I think it's, as planners, what we need is to calibrate the tools for addressing those needs.
I think it's a really good question, because once you say, so to a smaller developer or investor or a private landowner, once you say entertainment and lifestyle, like, they just see, oh my gosh, they're trying to take portions of our site and convert it into public use. And so it's a difficult conversation to have. But I think in terms of how do you encourage it or facilitate it, in my experience, it comes down to the story of, like, where they are, where their development is going, and how their development can make an impact in the surrounding area. I think there's a human element that sometimes gets missed, because development is very transactional. You've got land, and you put something on it, and they're going to make money. Like, that's the simplest formula. But when you look at talking to the investor or talking to the developer and having those conversations around, oh my gosh, like, you have such a unique opportunity right here, because this area, for example, doesn't have a local coffee shop. If you could get a coffee shop with a really cool patio that has some winterization to it, and, like, having more of a human conversation, I think makes a big difference. From what I understand and what I'm seeing in the development industry at the largest scale, so when you look at the big guys like Cadillac Fairview, Oxford, these guys they're shifting their whole models towards lifestyle. and they're looking at how are they incorporating residential, mixed use, entertainment, outdoor components, and it's shocking actually in the last few years to see that even the retail sector, they have this whole new genre of awards. So these companies are actually now being recognized for, hey, that development that you did in this city encouraged people to be on the site X amount of hours. Like, they're tracking this stuff. In the past, that's never really happened. Like, we've been used to seeing the big box model, smart centers, and they kind of just plop the same model everywhere. And it's been that's been our reality for the last 15 years. But it does seem like there's starting to become a shift and some sort of recognition for that human element to it. I think at the biggest scale, when you're dealing with large developers, that conversation may be easier because they can afford to incorporate those type of elements onto the site. Where that conversation becomes a little bit more difficult is with smaller investors, smaller developers, or private land owners. And it can be something so simple as, so in Timberlea, we have a development called Stone Creek. Well, it's not, I wouldn't call it an entertainment site, but it has an outdoor coffee shop with a patio. It has a nice restaurant that has an outdoor patio. It has a yoga studio. Like, these are all very little things, but when you combine those type of uses together in one site, you start to see a story. Like, you see people grabbing their coffee after they just did yoga and then grabbing their groceries, and it's cool to see the function of the space isn't just so isolated and sterile. But taking it to the next level and looking at how do we activate the parking lot areas and the concrete slabs in between, and you could take it to the very extreme, but really thinking about how is the site being used. It doesn't necessarily have to be this section here is for entertainment, for example. And even malls are starting to do it. Like our mall here in Fort McMurray, it's a stretch to call it a mall. Our indoor plaza in Fort McMurray, I've noticed that they're doing a lot for programming. Like, they're bringing kids in, they're doing Halloween pictures, like stuff that you would never typically see, especially here because people were so busy. That's what gets people in the doors, and I think property operators and owners, they're starting to realize that they have to have that element onto the site. It has to be there, or at least in close proximity to.
Marcelo, you commented on the lifestyle perspective, and I was just looking, I didn't realize how large the shadow population in the region was. I knew it was big. I also have a lot of friends and family members who've worked in the region over the years and kept hearing about Mac Island, you gotta go to Mac Island. So now I'm here. My question, not being that familiar with when these amenities were constructed in the whole boom cycle, did the construction of the recreation facilities in Fort McMurray and in the region help convert some of the population from the shadow population who is doing the fly-in, drive out, to actually becoming permanent residents?
Amanda might have an answer to that. I'll see if I can think of something else.
So what I've noticed, I've moved here in 2007. The turnover here is way lower than what it was when I first started working here. It seemed like when I started working here, people were leaving every year, every 2 years. When I moved here, there wasn't one place to do yoga. I'm not even kidding you. I'm like, where do I live? But now there's so many studios. There's probably about 7 studios. And to me, what that says is there's a different population here. There's a different dynamic that's in Fort McMurray. There's a lot of people who came out here to start their careers, like myself and Chris, who are now married, have kids. I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. You look at even the population split. You look at our aging population. Before it was dismal. Like, you could barely even track it because there was no people over the age of 65, it seemed. Whereas now we have a pocket population who are older. A lot of those people came up for work, had kids here, they're staying because their grandkids are here. In some cases, they're moving here because their grandkids live here. We now have the aging in place facility that had a high enough demand that we actually had to build a facility to accommodate. So just going back to your question around has there been a shift amongst the fly in, fly out, the camp population and the town population. I think the biggest difference is that the population in town is more of a stable population. There's roots that are being planted here in Fort McMurray that weren't in the past. The kinds of development that's here, like Mac Island, even restaurants, yoga studios, children's stores, all that mix has changed in the last 10 years to support a normalized, growing community. In terms of the camp population, yeah, it has decreased, but I would not say that decrease has shifted into our local Fort McMurray population. It's mostly to do with the economic decline. But it does, so as a region as a whole, what our goal is to get people who are up at those camps to at least consider living in Fort McMurray. Typically they come, they fly in, they fly out, they don't even want to look at Fort McMurray. Maybe they'll buy a pack of gum at the airport and that's it. We now want to have that opportunity to say, hey, there's actually a town here. If you could see your wife moving here, maybe your family will move here, like at least give them that option. In the past we used to have we used to look down a lot at the camp population. But really, when you think about it, our community wasn't really set up to accommodate new families and that growth that we now want. We were just in that panic mode. So these camps have played a very critical role in building out and supporting the oil sands development. They will always be there, but at least we want to have a fair playing ground where we can say, hey, maybe you would consider living in Fort McMurray because of X, Y, and Z. And I feel like we are bridging that gap. We are getting closer to that. When I first moved here in 2007, when people said, why would you live in Fort McMurray? I felt it was a little bit more difficult to explain why I lived in Fort McMurray. It was mostly because I'm starting my career here. But now I really feel like this place is a good place for families. Like I have 2 kids, they're in a nice school, we come down to Mac Island, it's a 15-minute drive down here. I moved here from Toronto, so it's like night and day difference, but all the things that I love about Fort McMurray are mostly community-based and quality of life-based, and that's the very thing that we're trying to improve on. And there's so many more improvements that we have to make as a region, but at least we're headed in the right direction.
What I'll add to that, just before I turn it over to Marcelo, is that we're faced with a little predicament there because the industrial operators locally, they'll have certain policies about attracting residents. So we do have to deal with that, the fact that they have policies about that. The other aspect of it is that we haven't really started keeping track of why people are moving and if they're moving. We have a division in our branch that's dealing with socioeconomics, so they do all the demographics, the census. They have recently started to do more of a deliberate attempt at work camp counts of the shadow population, and those counts have traditionally only included very few questions. And now what the supervisor of that unit is trying to do is introduce more questions to that camp count. Maybe one of those questions could be, what would it take you to move into town? Or have you, learning a little bit more about their movement patterns. I do happen to know that industry itself has conducted a study like that. They have asked their membership, what would it take you to move into town? What is preventing you from making that leap? And facilities and amenities is certainly a part of that, but we haven't kept track of those numbers yet. So as we start to do that, I think we'll have a better answer to that question.
I don't know why I didn't talk about this. So Syncrude and Suncor 2 weeks ago announced that their local procurement has totally shifted. This is like a pretty big point, actually. So Syncrude and Suncor are giving preferential treatment to local employees, which they haven't done in the past. And also when it comes to procurement, they're giving priority to local. And even when it comes down to local gifts that they buy, or gifts that they buy for their staff appreciation, Christmas parties, that kind of stuff, there's been a whole program now that they just unveiled about a week or 2 ago, where they're saying that these kinds of purchases have to be purchased in Fort McMurray. So industry has stepped it up, and they are trying to at least involve Fort McMurray into their operations.
Yeah, I think when you, from the consulting side, when you look into those big investments, you have to look into the placemaking side. That's what you talked about, how people are going to feel attached to that infrastructure, that significant investment that you're doing, and utilize and kind of retain the population locally. So I'm from Edmonton, so in Edmonton, everybody knows what's going on in the ICE district. But what we feel is the ICE district is not about the arena, it's about the Oilers. Like people, everything is happening around the ICE districts today, not because of the arena. It's because of what the arena means to the team and to the city. And right now, the ICE district is almost complete, so we're looking at what's the next thing that is happening in downtown Edmonton. So west of the ICE district, there's going to be a new Central Park. It's the warehouse, we call it a warehouse district park. Since the council approved the purchase of the land expropriation and it's going to the design phase, everything around that area is booming. There's about 2,500 to 3,000 units being proposed by a few developers. 1,000 square meters of entertainment and retail. So everything now is about what that park is going to mean for Edmontonians. And all those developers, they want to participate in the development of the park. They want to have a say in that park because they see what is at stake for them and for the success of their business. So it's, when Chris posed that question at the beginning, how do you see collaboration between the private sector and the public sector? I would just go further. There is kind of it's more than just collaboration. It's a partnership that they have to bring something in because there is investments on both sides.
Time for one final question, if anybody has one. All right, thank you.
Hi, Daniel Moore from University of Alberta. Kind of talking about growth and kind of population influxes in Fort McMurray. I was wondering, because you also mentioned you were developing your new municipal development plan. So I was wondering where you're predicting this growth to occur, and kind of also where do you see these kind of population influxes? Are they located more within central Fort McMurray or within the kind of newer communities? And how do you plan on dealing with these population changes in the future, either being through new communities or within the existing built-up area? And what role you think that has on the overall sustainability of Fort McMurray?
Sounded like at least a two-parter question, if not a three-parter. It's fortuitous that you have the three of us up here to answer that question, because I know that Marcelo, his firm, was responsible for helping us with the fringe area plan. In a nutshell, we have a number of very, very large development areas that have been sitting mostly empty and ready for development for a number of years. One of them is Saline Creek out towards the airport. Another one is Parsons Creek. Those are communities that are designed for 25,000 people apiece, roughly. And that's a lot of capacity. So those are identified in the municipal development plan. They're identified in the precursor, the fringe area plan. We have even some areas planned out beyond that, should we ever need them. Areas to the south, areas to the north across the Clearwater River. So should we ever get to the point that we find that we've exhausted the 45, 50,000 person capacity that we have, we do have more area north and south that have been explored at a fairly high level, but we have costed out what infrastructure might cost to provide to those communities. Is there anything else that the panel would like to provide in addition to that? Have we?
We haven't talked about the fire at all, which is we deliberately didn't do that because it's no longer a real issue, and it's easy to get carried away with talking about it. But the interesting about that event was the housing stock that it mostly took out was a lot of the older housing stock, and the new development is obviously in those areas that burnt down. But it's just interesting to see the dynamic of the housing market, because when Parsons Creek came alongside, which was a whole new area for development, there are new homes there now, we anticipated that those houses would be built out a lot quicker than what they have been. The economic decline was the number one reason why it hasn't moved so quickly. But also with the fire rebuild, you've got 3 older communities that, for the lack of a better word, were basically they were aged. They weren't the primary areas where people wanted to invest. And now those areas have all brand new homes in them. So it's interesting to see that whole dynamic where we definitely did not plan for something like that. We now have that new housing stock on our market. And then in terms of the future growth areas, it's still slated for the Sailing Creek and Parsons Creek area as we had identified. And if I don't know if any of the tours go through Parsons Creek, but there's actually streets, there's curbs, there's lights in place. Like that community is just waiting for some development and growth. But we definitely have those areas now slotted for, and they're ready. Whereas in the past, we just didn't have any areas at all to expand to. So we are in a good position in that regard.
I think we're all done. Thank you.
You're done? Everybody's complete, satisfied? Thank you to our panel today, Marcelo, Chris, Amanda. Awesome questions. We not only want to thank you with our applause, you can continue to applaud while I give them a little token of our appreciation. That concludes our land use and economic development panel. I have a brief reminder and an invitation to all of you. Please join us tonight for the reception at 6:30 at Town Hall Pub. It's going to be a full meal, not just appetizers, so they wanted me to highlight that bit. It's going to be a full meal. You're all invited. Please join us and continue to enjoy the conference. Thank you so much.